So good morning, everybody. It is just past 9 o'clock and I'm just going to get started. I think that people might jump in to join us a little bit later, and that's fine, but I think let's just get started for now. I think this is a thought-provoking quote that we've got here from David Attenborough, made in 2012. And what he's telling us is that natural world, and a big part of this is biodiversity, is life. And when I say life, I mean everything about our lives. So the natural world provides us with the water that we use, not just to drink, but in manufacturing, provides metals for our mobile phones, cotton for our clothes, fish for our fish and chips, and the ingredients of a Big Mac. And so our lives and industry really depend on the natural world. So welcome to this morning's talk. And today we're going to be talking about biodiversity and biodiversity net gain, which is a key part of the natural world. So our speakers today are myself. My name is Leslie Wilson. I'm a lead standards development manager here at BSI, and I've been delivering standard solutions for business and environmental sustainability for over 10 years. So that includes things like carbon mitigation and adaptation, environmental management, sustainable finance, and of course biodiversity and natural capital, amongst other things. And I've been fortunate enough to work nationally and internationally with experts on this to create standards of good practice, hopefully to make a more sustainable and secure world. And then joining me today is Dr. Julia Baker, who is a biodiversity technical specialist at Balfour Beatty, and her work includes delivery of biodiversity net gain projects, large ones and small ones, and rural and urban sites. And she was the convener of a writing group for a standard that we published this year called BSI 683. We're going to talk about that later. And she was also the lead author of the UK's Good Practice Principles on Biodiversity Net Gain, which we're also going to talk about later. And Julia is also a visiting researcher at the University of Oxford. So hi, Julia, how are you today?
Yeah, hello, morning, and morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Looking forward to discussing biodiversity and net gain.
Thanks, Julia. And then we also have with us today Jo. Jo Treweek is the director of TEC, an ecological consultancy based in the UK. And she works in both the UK and also overseas, so she's got a really broad knowledge. She specialises in ecological impact assessments, biodiversity due diligence for financial institutions, and the design and implementation of biodiversity offsets. And Jo's also the director of the UK Habitat Classification. Hi, Jo.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Hi, how are you? Is there anything you wanted to add to that description of you?
No, that's all fine. It's just that, yeah, it's all about moving from identifying the problem to taking some action, because as you showed with your quote from David Attenborough, you know, we've had an ongoing and long decline of biodiversity all around the world, and it's getting to crisis point now. So we're hoping that the whole biodiversity net gain initiative can build some positive action.
Yeah, it's useful. So I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping before we start. So first off, as you can probably tell already, we're going to keep this informal. It's 9 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday. You don't want to us just talking to slides. And so we're going to try and take your comments as we go through. So use the Q&A box, put in any questions you have into the Q&A box, and I'll try and pick them up and we'll try to address them as we go. And then today's agenda really is a kind of a bit of like, well, getting to know you, find out what that is. Talk a little bit about biodiversity and biodiversity net gain. And then we're going to talk about the principles of biodiversity net gain. We're going to try to relate them practically to organizations and what they might be doing. And then we're going to talk about our new standard, BSI 683 on biodiversity net gain, that we're all very excited about, that we published earlier this year. So just to start off, I kind of wanted to get a sense of, I don't know, just something to get everyone involved. Now, I was going to do a poll, and then I discovered yesterday that we weren't able to do polls. So hopefully this will work. Okay, so do you interact with biodiversity in your work? And option one is it's barely mentioned, but my organization does have an environmental policy. Option 2 is my organization is actively promoting biodiversity solutions. And option 3 is I'm an active stakeholder in biodiversity actions within my organization. So it just means you actually do things around biodiversity. So if you can put your answers, I'm saying in the chat box, but put it in the Q&A box, put your answers in the Q&A box, and just 1, 2, or 3. If it's none of the above, you can say none of the above. And if you don't want to tell me that information, then that's completely fine as well. So I can't see any. Oh, here we go. Oh, off, and we're off in the Q&A box. Look at that. Oh, it's quite a mixture so far. I've only had 4 replies, but you know, that's a good start. Does anybody else want to tell us how involved they are in biodiversity? Is it barely mentioned? Is your organization actively promoting it? Or do you in fact take part in biodiversity in your own organization? Okay, I'm gonna go with what we have, where it's a bit of everything of the 4 replies. So that's quite interesting.
There's quite a lot in the
chat box.
in the chat.
Well,
yeah, there's quite a lot in the chat.
There is more, isn't there? So there's lots of 2s and just a lot of 2s actually. So a lot of people, their organizations actively promoting biodiversity solutions. So that's really great to hear. I'm really pleased. Thanks for doing that. Oops, let me just click here, go on to the next slide. Here we go. So I guess we're going to talk a lot about biodiversity today because we're going to be talking about biodiversity net gain. And so what do we mean when we talk about biodiversity? Now I've been talking all the time so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw this question over to somebody else. So Joe, what do we mean today when we talk about biodiversity?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. So it seems like a lot of people on this call know perfectly well what we mean when we talk about biodiversity, but essentially biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth in all its varied dimensions and levels. So it could mean genetic diversity of one population of a species right through to the variety we see in a landscape with all its ecosystems and species populations and the habitats they use. So it's a very global and big concept, but the point is that it can be measured, and it's a term that's meant to emphasize for us the importance of maintaining diversity so that we keep that variety of life, because we depend on it in ways that we know and ways that we don't know yet. And in this country, often we use it as a kind of proxy for nature conservation in a more general sense.
Thank you. And so why is biodiversity important? Julia, why do you think biodiversity is important? And particularly, I guess, for organizations, because most of the people who are joining us today are going to be joining us. There'll be committee members who work with us. They'll all come from different types of organizations. And why is biodiversity an important thing to be thinking about?
Well, I think on a personal level, I mean, you know, that amazing quote by David Attenborough, you know, really kind of summed it up in terms of there's 2 things really. It sustains life. You know, it gives us the services, the clean air, the soils, the way to grow food. It sustains our life, but it's also what makes things really precious. And during COVID, when we were going through that lockdown, you know, you're kind of chatting with colleagues and checking in with people, how are you and everything. And I mean, I work for Beaton, you know, there's engineers, there's project managers, there's only a very small number of us kind of biodiversity folk. And every single person I spoke to, no matter where they were within the organisation, no matter, you know, where they are in the kind of the food chain, if you like, every single one mentioned how important it was just to get out and see something green. You know, and I think our relationship with nature's really changed. And I knew so many people like, gosh, you know, my 1 hour outside during the day, I just found this park that I didn't know was there. Or, you know, I certainly found some new spaces just up the road from me. And I think now, and what's been really interesting with the discussions around COP and how that's just in everyday lives. You know, people are talking about it much more so now, and I think it's really starting to come home in terms of how special biodiversity is, not just in terms of what we, you know, what makes you know, our quality of life special, but also how much we depend on it and how vulnerable we are with it. And then there is business. So I work for a contractor. You know, we turn up on site and we build things, and I work in major projects and we build big things. We completely rely on, I mean, just to such an extent, on the environment that we work in. You know, we rely on the soils, the places that we work, particularly because when you're moving around earthworks and then you're replanting, you know, just the additional cost if that soil is really degraded. And, you know, we do a lot of woodland planting, whatever that might be, mitigation, and then coming into net gain. The best thing that we can do is work with a pretty resilient, healthy environment to start with. You know, just because it has that place that we can look at avoidance, which we'll get into a little bit, you know, really minimizing our impacts, but then support nature on its kind of net gain journey. When you're working with someone that is really degraded, it is so fragile and so vulnerable that our impacts are just so much more. So as a business, you know, just the fact that we come in and build something big, we're completely reliant on the environment. And then there's our supply chain. You know, we rely on tarmac, on concrete, on all the stuff that has an impact on nature. And for those industries to work, we need them to have a net gain outcome, because then they'll be sustainable over the long term. So it's really becoming, I think, so much more so just how dependent we are on these things. And it's not immediately obvious, because our business model is we come in, we build something big and fancy, then we go. You know, there's always that handover to us. And there is a maintenance aspect of our company, and they really get it. Like, no, we're here for 10 years. We really get how much dependent we are. But in that business model, when you come in and you build something big and you go, we're now starkly aware of just how dependent we are, you know, on the natural world.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. It's interesting you mentioned COP26 there. People often think about COP26 being around carbon reduction and energy reduction and so on. People often forget that the natural world, biodiversity, is all tied into this as well. So related to that, I know there's a lot of issues around biodiversity loss, and some of them are related to climate change. So Joe, are you able to talk to us a little bit more about maybe about what the drivers for biodiversity loss are, or how biodiversity sort of in the natural world sort of fits into climate change? That's a really bad way of putting it, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, so it works both ways. So climate change is having a really significant effect on biodiversity itself. So it's affecting the distributions and ranges of species globally and within our own country. It's causing shifts in where species occur and the sort of habitat, the ecological niches that are available to them. And one of the issues that follows on from that is an increasing problem with alien invasive species. So some species are more able to colonize new climate niches than others are, and some of those species can get a little bit ahead of themselves and take over. So globally, the problems associated with spread of species that are occurring where they haven't occurred before, and then outcompeting other native species is a massive problem. And in fact, it's one of the top global drivers of biodiversity loss. And many of these problems date from quite recently, you know, so especially with plants, problems with invasive plants really date from the last 70 years or so. So it's something associated with global trade combined with changing climate and increasing modification by people of ecosystems all around the world. And even going back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, you may remember that concluded that a really, really high proportion of the world's ecosystems are actually in a degraded condition, and a condition in which their resilience is poor and the level to which they can service humanity is declining. So that's one sort of knock-on effect of climate change. Another is combined with other things, the COVID crisis or other pandemics can be linked to climate change, because climate change causes disruption in the stability of ecosystems and species populations. And if you combine that with habitat destruction for infrastructure development or agriculture around the world, you get increasing contact between people who are living in poverty and populations of species that are being disrupted, such as bats, for example. So a lot of issues to do with biodiversity are actually cumulative, synergistic issues. You know, it's multiple drivers causing tipping points to be reached, and that's happening a lot all around the world. Another effect of climate change is to make resources more at risk. So water supplies, air quality, all of which can also affect species. So one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is a huge mining project in West Africa, which could potentially destroy a water tower, so a montane system that recharges aquifers and streams and rivers that are fundamentally depended on by a whole variety of species in a World Heritage Site. So, you know, there are very complex linkages that we have to be aware of and manage, and climate change is just making it a whole lot harder to keep everything stable.
Thank you. Julia, you look like you wanted to say something there, or no?
Yeah, I think, and touching on Joe's point, part of the problem is it's really difficult to get this, you know, to join those dots, you know, and so we only have an idea of the scale of the problem, and it relies on us, you know, monitoring, understanding, collecting the right data, and really being able to, you know, to join the dots. And you know, it comes back to Joe's point. Biodiversity is measurable. You can get those proxy indicators. Is our choice of that indicator right? You know, is it telling us the information we really need to know? You can't join the dots unless you know what the dots are, you know, and you really understand them. So that linkage between climate and biodiversity, we're not there yet in industry, and I think it's a really important point. And, you know, as we go through this, we can tie it in with biodiversity net gain. But, you know, there's a lot of, okay, this is the problem, but certainly when you come down to my world, it's that, do we have that fine level of detail to be able to integrate the solutions, you know, within infrastructure development?
Fantastic. And of course, if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it. So that's also key.
Not when you work with engineers, you don't, as I do, you know. I mean, it's you know, the way that we work in industry, and if people are looking at us to be a major driving force of the solution, it's, you know, and I think it's worth pointing out what Joe just talked about. There's a whole spectrum of human activities that are contributing to biodiversity loss. Now, we need to recognize our place within industry and our role, and, you know, our role to find those solutions, if you like, but also everything else, you know, everything else that's going on is just one big picture. And I have my particular, you know, role and site of my work, but I'm always conscious of this wider context. So there's the kind of joining the dots between what's going on in the environment, but there's also joining the dots at our level, you know, and how can we come up with those solutions? And we do need a much better understanding, as Joe said, of cumulative impacts, especially.
Yeah, it's always useful just to be able to make a start, you know, even though it's quite a complex thing, isn't it, biodiversity? But as an organizations shouldn't be put off by the complexity. They should just, you know, it's always good to be able to make a start and then build on your knowledge as you go. I said that I would take questions from the audience as we go, and so there is one question. The question is, creating a biodiversity landscape and then filling it with light at night is a problem. How can you mitigate against that? Are either of you able to answer that question?
Joe, you go for it and then I'll jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, I totally agree. It's definitely a problem. It's an increasing problem. And personally, I'm hoping that improved awareness of climate risks might persuade some planning authorities and local authorities to limit light at night. I mean, there are technological solutions which reduce light pollution. So increasingly on the projects I work on overseas, we try and use modern downward directed lighting, and we try and avoid using it in areas where there are vulnerable species. But really, it is a huge problem that we have to tackle, and I think it's probably at a quite strategic level that we should be trying to tackle it. I don't have an answer, but I hope we find one.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, it's all about the careful planning at the start. You know, so people have got to light it. Why are you lighting it? You know, why is that lighting there? And really understand that. Okay, safety concerns. Okay, so where's the safety issues? Can we address the safety issues rather than lighting it? You know what? You know, so there's that kind of higher up the chain problem, as well as Joe said. You know, let's get really focused in terms of, you know, what light bulb are we used? How can we shield the lighting pollution? Okay, this is definitely a no-go area because there's some sensitive, you know, wildlife there, whatever that might be. So it's a great question, and the earlier that we ask it, the more likely that we are to find solutions down the line. But also, why are we lighting? You know, why is that lighting there? And interestingly, the carbon argument has really helped with that, actually, because clients that I work with also have to think about their carbon footprint. So, you know, there's all these different pieces of the puzzle.
That's a good point about the carbon. That's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily have thought of that. So, of course, today, what we're here to talk about is biodiversity net gain. And let's start by making sure we sort of know what we mean when we're talking about biodiversity net gain. So Julia, can you tell us what we mean by biodiversity net gain, and also, I guess, why it's important?
Yes, so actually, if you can go on to the next slide. If you go on to the next slide, yeah, I really like this definition, actually, because I think it shows us what the kind of the vision and the ambition is. Development that leaves the natural environment in a measurably better state than before. So it's very much related to development. So what that means is, because that housing development or that new road or that railway or that power project, because that has happened, nature's better off. And if you think about it, that's a fundamentally different way of thinking about development. That housing estate leaves nature better off. That road will leave nature better off. And what that does is that starts us on a very different and exciting and challenging path to say we've got to rethink how we think about development. We're moving from a stage of, okay, development versus nature, let's mop up the damage, to how can development be truly sustainable and leave the natural environment not just in a better state than we found it, but a measurably better state. And we're working towards that. You know, we're getting the nuts and bolts in place. There's the metric, which we'll come to. There's, you know, the training, the capacity, there's the skills. We've got legislation coming in. But it relies on all of us to start rethinking what we call development, really. And it's about time. You know, we can no longer be okay with development that has an economic case, but that economic case doesn't account for the environmental cost of that development. And it's on all of us to think, okay, this development needs to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state, because then that will be better for us, and that will, you know, really save us. And there's that measurably bit as well. So if you go on to the next slide, I'm going to keep going if that's okay. We've got our good practice principles. So one of the most important things when you work in sustainable development, you know, within sustainability, within development, is to set a benchmark of what does good look like. You know, we're talking about biodiversity net gain. Okay, great. We've got the end goal, development that leaves the natural environment in a better state before, but how do we get there? And what does good look like? So when we started talking back in the day about biodiversity net gain, and there was a kind of interest, and interest started to get up into a bit of momentum, we didn't have anything, you know, internationally, and, you know, a lot of the work that Joe's worked on internationally, there are these principles and standards, but we didn't have our own UK set, really. So right back, it was about 2016, there was a group of us came together and really thought, okay, what does good look like when we applied biodiversity net gain approach to us in industry? We came up with these 10 principles. They're free to download. The website links there. We also published a practical guide to support their implementation. So the deal is, you know, and this is from us in industry, if we are talking about biodiversity net gain and we really want to integrate that approach and that outcome as part of our projects, it is about good practice, and it is about not just picking and choosing the principles that we like and thinking, well, that one's a bit difficult, let's leave that one. It's about the whole set of principles that come in together.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. You jumped ahead slightly for me, but that's good. So this document is free to go into and read online. As Julia says, the link is there. Obviously, we've not gone through all the different 10 principles in detail, but what I thought would be useful for us just to talk about a few of the principles and then try to talk about them in terms of a practical application. And so, Julia, I know you've put together some thoughts on that already. If you'd like to sort of kick off with that, that'd be great. Yeah,
okay. Well, let's start. If you jump onto the next slide, I think it's the next slide that brings it one on. Yeah, there we go. So principle number one. Number one is number one for a reason, and it's the most important. It's what's called the mitigation hierarchy, and it's a process. It's a process that you go through, and the first two steps are preventing. You know, so you avoid biodiversity loss, and then you minimise the loss. So that's the avoidance bit. And you know what the interesting thing about the mitigation hierarchy is that it's been entrenched. It's been part of planning permission for so long. I mean, it's been there for quite a long time, and we've always had it in the guidelines for ecological impact assessment. So that's nothing new. The new bit is the outcome when you go through the mitigation hierarchy. The new bit is that we follow the process of mitigation hierarchy to achieve net gain. And in a brilliant way, what that does is that it shines the spotlight on the first two bits. So if you think about your baselines, this is the baseline of biodiversity, and after development you've got to have an uplift. You know, you've got to have a measurable increase afterwards. If you start off with a lot of biodiversity loss, you're kind of way down the track there. It's much harder to get to neutrality, and then you've got to get the uplift as well. So in a brilliant way, biodiversity net gain is shining a light saying, well, you've really got to start avoiding the really sensitive biodiversity features, because they will really come back. You know, it's going to make biodiversity net gain much harder. So from purely a business perspective, it's, you know, it's the right thing to do.
Thank you. Okay, and were you going to give further examples? I'm just thinking about the next slides.
Yeah, no, if you want me to, can you go for it? So
yeah,
if you go on to the next one. Okay, go for it then. Keep going.
Yeah, let me just get it to work. There we go. Oops, sorry.
No, that's it. So
that's it.
How do we do that? So avoid biodiversity loss. This is when I become reliant and dependent on the engineers. So, you know, again, this is very much specific to my world, and I work in major infrastructure projects, and I can highlight the biodiversity features, you know, the wildlife features, the really important stuff to avoid, but it comes back down to that design and bringing people along with the journey, particularly the engineering team, so they get it, and really understanding what are the engineering solutions here. And avoidance is every little thing counts, because we measure our impact. Every little bit counts, and I can do that. So I can show the engineers the impact of their choices. And it's really what I love about biodiversity net gain, because it's not the job of just the biodiversity person. We have to work as a whole design and construction team. And just to give you a few examples, the one on the left, it was a lovely mature tree actually, and you know, there's a woodland just to the side there. And I was speaking with our arborist. I was like, okay, the embankment, it just goes straight through it. There must be some idea here. So he just sketched that out and said, well, I don't know if this is going to work, but let's sketch it out. But because he started that conversation, we went to the engineers and they looked at it and politely explained why that couldn't work. But it started the conversation. They were engaged, they got it. They were like, okay, well, that can't work, but can we do that? And can we do that? And you know, we did, you know, end up saving that tree. And on the one on the right, the project manager was just fantastic. You know, he gave this big spiel about avoiding and really challenged his engineers to come up with those finer design solutions. And I started to get these brilliant emails saying, Julia, I think we could save this bit. You know, that was literally from the engineering team. And that little bit was pretty tiny, but the guy who found it and the guy who saved it owned it. And that's my job also. About it's not just doing biodiversity net gain, but how do I mainstream is a word that used quite a lot, but how do I truly integrate it into the lifeblood of what we do on major projects? And the avoidance bit, I can't redesign an engineering slope, and frankly don't want to. So I'm reliant on the wider team getting how important it is, and dedicating their time to doing it. So if we go on to the next slide. So the other thing about biodiversity net gain, and Leslie, if you want to jump in at any stage, do so. And the really wonderful thing, and it comes back to what Joe was saying, is that it's all about habitat. So the metric that we're using here in England is very much the habitat-based metric. So if you go on to the next slide, a little screenshot of the metric, and you can see there the data. The data is about habitats. So a lot of people who work in the industry might be used to colleges talking about bats or great crested newts or dormice, and that's very much still a part of this. But when you work with biodiversity net gain, you're really thinking much broader. You're really thinking in terms of the habitats that we're impacting, but also the habitats that we're going to be enhancing or creating or restoring as part of net gain. So if you keep going on a little bit on the slides, yeah, keep going. It's just to highlight this. So when, if I get to site and I'm explaining biodiversity net gain, and the construction team are like, okay, yeah, we get it. What does that physically mean when we're on site? Julia, we've got to build this bridge or whatever. What do you physically want us to do? And there's a moment actually when net gain becomes really simple, because it's a habitat-based concept, the approach that we're applying here in England. There's only two options. We're either going to be creating more habitat than we had to start with, or we'll be making the existing habitats better. And for that, we need space. So when we're thinking about our development, you can't squeeze nature into a corner and expect it to be okay. We need the space. And there's so much ecology thinking and principles behind that. But in a simplistic way, when I'm speaking with engineers or project managers, you just need to try and get the concept, like create new habitat, make existing habitats better, and where's that going to go? And I was talking to one of the teams, and Nick, one of the engineers, at the end of the day, he produced this drawing and said, Julia, I think we've got some space here. And while I was really delighted that he did that, 5 meters isn't that much. It's just like, yeah, I think we need a little bit more, Nick. But he got it. He just got the fact that there was some space, that he kind of rather ambitiously put a tree in there. But we need to plan and think about developments with space for nature.
Thank you. That's really useful. I really like the bit where you're talking about creating solutions by talking to other members of the team, saying, this is the issue. What do you think? But what do you think? Can we do this? Just sort of thinking the way around a solution rather than just being one yes or no binary answer. Oops, hold on a second. Let me get these slides to the next one. We're going to talk to this slide. Yeah.
So just really quickly, I always thought this is quite a big example, because people just expect net gain to be something big and expensive, and you've got to really, really go into it. But this was just a drainage improvement scheme that we had. It was to do with an airport, actually, stripping out the drainage, putting back in new suds. And the team were quite interested, the client team, and they said, well, can you run the metric? We've designed it. We're just quite interested in seeing if we've got biodiversity net gain. So if you click on the next slide, we're like, yeah, sure. Give us what you've got, give us your seeding. And under what we call a do nothing, so they weren't doing anything for net gain, they were just doing the normal design. Pretty basic amenity grassland mix, and it was a deficit. So we could say, you are in a deficit there, minus 8.5, and they were like, oh gosh, we didn't realise that. Could you have a look at the grass seeding mix? Is there anything you can do? So we then worked with our botanist. We worked with a couple of local seed suppliers. So if you go on to the next slide, so we had the scenario which is called do something for net gain. The only thing that we did is that we changed the grassland mix, and we moved them from a minus 8.5 to a plus 5%. So, okay, they're on their way to net gain if you're measuring it by a minimum of 10%, but it was no extra cost. And sometimes it is the smallest little tweaks to design, just that biodiversity thinking at the start, and you get a much better outcome.
Yeah, the thinking is important, right? Thinking about it at the start, and identifying any sort of issues, and as I was saying before, talking to other people about what the solutions might look like. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks so much, Julia. Now we are running out of time, so I'm going to skip a little bit, if that's okay, and I'm going to ask Jo, if you were creating a business case for biodiversity net gain, if you're one of our participants today in your organization and you listen to us and you think actually biodiversity net gain is a good thing, we could do with some of that in our organization, what kind of business case, what might you include in a business case, what kind of reasons might you give about why it's a good thing?
Yeah, okay, so I have to do this a great deal in my work, actually. I often find myself in a position where I'm having to justify a scope of work that I'm suggesting, or really even explain to the people I'm working with why they need to even consider biodiversity at all. And there are several fairly well-known arguments that you might use. And a very important one is around license to operate. And this often seems like it's going to be more of a significant issue in a sort of big overseas project where people might be actually resettled as a result of the project. So you might be looking to develop a big mine or an oil and gas project where you're actually going to move people to live elsewhere. And obviously in that case, there's significant risk of social unrest if you don't look at the problem in its entirety. And what typically can happen is that people are relocated away from habitats, biodiversity, ecosystems that they fundamentally depend on for their livelihoods. So that you can see easily that would be the case for people living in the Amazon rainforest or the Arctic, where they're depending fundamentally on very limited resources to live. But it's also an issue in this country, much more than we might think, because people really do value their environment and the biodiversity that they live with. And it can cause a lot of upset if people feel that's being destroyed without them having any ability to express their concerns or make sure that those biodiversity values are replaced. So, we've seen that often with opposition to big infrastructure projects, that you've really got to carry people with you. So social license to operate is very important. Also, shareholders in businesses often feel very, very strongly about how biodiversity is affected by projects and want to see that everything's being done well and that they're not implicitly supporting damage. So that's another good reason. As Julia said, it can often actually be more cost effective to do the right thing for biodiversity and the environment. Not doing the right thing or not using those solutions can often result in costly damages and issues that need to be managed later down the road. So if you don't do good footprint management, if you cause soil erosion, if you don't manage surface runoff well, if you well, there's a whole host of things I can think of that might require costly solutions later if you don't manage them well at the beginning. So those are just some examples of what I would do to convince somebody.
Thank you. Julia, you really look like you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, just to completely support Jo, being on major infrastructure projects when, you're kind of working in the world where you do get a lot of opposition and, it is about the environmental impact, and it's not okay anymore. It comes back to that point about really planning biodiversity net gain from the start. You can't retrofit this stuff in. It's not okay to go ahead business as usual and, well, we'll plant some trees over there somewhere. That's not what this is about.
No, and even just access to finance, increasingly, in fact, a major part of my work is due diligence for projects where businesses are trying to access finance from international lenders, and they have very high standards for biodiversity now, which a project would have to comply with. So in many cases, you just can't access the money you need to develop your project unless you're looking after biodiversity as you should.
And if it's all right, there's a quite interesting question about how developers have taken on board biodiversity net gain. I don't know about you, Joe, but I'm finding it's really varying. You know, there were some key front runners, you know, like Highways England published their biodiversity plan back in 2015, I think it was. They were at Rail, were doing some pilots, the housing developers, you know, so you do get a kind of a spectrum of people like, no, we'll just wait till the law comes along, you know, versus, you know, National Grid. There's different energy companies out there really interested in these, but also at different stages of where they are in terms of their level of maturity. And it is about also us in industry. So developers might take biodiversity net gain on board, but are we ready as ecologists? Do we have the right skills to identify habitats, to plan nature for a 30-year period? So it's not just whether developers have taken it on board, it's us as an industry as well. You know, we've really got to step up to the challenge.
So thank you very much for that. I'm very aware we have 3 minutes left. And so I might skip forward in our slides a little bit because I know we really want to mention the standard that we published earlier this year, which is the process for designing and implementing biodiversity net gain. And this came out on the 31st of August, and it was led by Julia. And Joe was part of the team. Well, more than part, it's a key part of the team, I would say. And yeah, and if you want to find out more about this, then you can find it on our shop, and there's also a webinar that tells you all about it. Julia, are you able to say in about 60 seconds or less?
Yes, exactly.
What it is about.
So if you're interested in biodiversity net gain, this gives you the process. Step 1, step 2, step 3. It just takes you through the process of designing and implementing biodiversity net gain. And we need that, right? It comes back to what does good look like? So it is about the process to follow, and that's based on good practice, because if you follow that process, it gives us confidence that down the line, you know, good 30 years, maybe more down the line, you will achieve biodiversity net gain. So it gives you the process to follow.
Thank you. That was very succinct. Trying to do slides and microphones all at the same time here. That was really good. So do go find out more information about that. So lots of you have sent us questions, and so my apologies for not getting to them, just not enough time. What we will do afterwards, we'll try and reply and see if Gracia somehow can get those replies to you. So I'm just going to leave you with this quote, and this is from Tony Juniper, who's the chair of Natural England, which sounds very, well, he's the chair of Natural England, but apparently he's a long-time campaigner and activist, and someone recently described him as the Chris Packham of his time. But he makes a really great point in this quote from their Nature Positive website. Nature recovery is within our grasp. We can become nature positive by 2030, provided we act now. We need to go high, nature and low carbon, tackling the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change together. And their publication, Nature Positive, shows how they can do that. That wasn't a plug. I didn't miss that last piece. But the important thing is about the need to start doing something. And as I said before, don't necessarily be put off by complexity. It's always good just to get going. So Joe, Julia, thank you so much for taking part today. I don't know if you're,
absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you everyone who's joined us today. And again, apologies for not getting to your questions, and I'm bang on time. So I'm expecting you're all going to jump off and go to the next interesting topic. So thanks very much for joining us today. Thank you.